Hi, and welcome to Mediatwits number 169. I'm Mark Glaser, founder and executive editor of MediaShift. Today we'll be talking about Kiva, the micro-lending, microfinance site, and whether it has some lessons for the rest of us in journalism and media when it comes to funding. Journalism's always looking for new and different models. We've looked at crowdfunding, crowdfinancing. Is there a way that we can kind of take something from the Kiva model? We'll be talking to Kiva co-founder Jessica Jackley, also founded ProFounder, to hear her take. She just wrote the book Clay, Water, Brick. We'll be talking to her about that, and also talking to some people in crowdfunding to learn more about where this might be applicable for journalists and independent journalism. Before we get started, a word from our sponsor. Running your own business requires focus, and so does parenting. Mediatwits podcast sponsor NextSpace created a place where parents can give their best attention to both. Co-working space and childcare space under one roof. Learn more at nextspace.us/nextkids. We also have great news for podcasting fans. MediaShift is producing a collab space workshop in San Francisco on September 12th at KQED with a focus on podcasting and audio innovation. Sponsored by the Donald W. Reynolds Journalism Institute, Collab Space will include keynotes from Steve Henn of Planet Money and Aminatou Sow of Call Your Girlfriend. Learn more at bit.ly/collabsf and use the collab20 code for 20% off your entry fee. So before we get into our discussion, I want to introduce our panel. We have Jessica Jackley joining us, co-founder of Kiva, author of Clay, Water, Brick. Khari Johnson, editor of Through the Cracks on crowdfunding journalism. David Cohn, former Badass, founder of Spot Us, current Al Jazeera Badass. And Dan Fletcher at Beacon. And our producer, Jefferson Yen, in Los Angeles. So this new book, Clay, Water, Brick, by Jessica Jackley, really interesting story about just, really a memoir about what made her decide to start Kiva, a microfinancing site that really has helped connect people in the West to entrepreneurs, really, really tiny kind of entrepreneurs in the developing world. And over the 10 years of its existence, it's raised more than $740 million with a 98% repayment rate, which is pretty incredible. And this book is a really interesting story about, Jessica, you tell a really interesting story about just as a child how you really wanted to give to charity, but there was something broken about that. Tell us that story and just how Kiva was able to kind of fix it to some extent.
I would love to think that Kiva has actually fixed that story. I think what I felt was broken, as you said, growing up, was this connection that was forged between myself and individuals in the world that I so longed to serve, that I was really told it was my job to serve, it was my responsibility as somebody who was not living in poverty, and as a person in the faith community where I grew up in a little Christian church, not far from where I am now. I'm actually at my parents' house this week back in Pittsburgh. The story that I heard a lot was one that told me there were people out there that needed a lot of help, and they sort of needed me to swoop in and save them. And in fact, often the trigger, the way that I would be compelled to help was by feeling really bad. I would be told stories based on sadness and suffering and desperation. I didn't realize growing up that they were somewhat slanted stories, or certainly just focused on one thread of an individual story. But that side of things made me feel guilty, even shameful about my own relative middle-class American wealth. And so the worse I felt, the more likely I was to want to make myself feel better and to participate, to give, or to donate of my time, my money, whatever it was that they were asking, these well-intentioned nonprofits and NGOs were asking me to do. Now, I think one of the things that Kiva did was to allow for a more transparent and honest, I think, story about both the opportunities as well as the challenges in the lives of a person that you see on the site, often living in pretty severe poverty. It's not always the case, though. Now there's all sorts of individuals there, and we can go into that if you'd like. But I think it gave an opportunity for those individuals to tell more than just one side of the story, to do that a little bit more directly, and to do it in a way that invited a new kind of participation, which is the thing that's kind of the end game, right? You don't just want to put something out there, but you want to change not how people just believe in something or see something, but change how they want to and can participate in the world. So to have a story not just based on sadness, but based on opportunity and, my God, entrepreneurship, right? That was a new thing, at least to me, and that's what Kiva aimed to do. And then to allow people not just to donate, but to lend, which, you know, I think donor-beneficiary relationships can get weird, for lack of a more scientific word. Like there's this endless sort of need to thank the donor that lives up here and the beneficiary is down here. With a loan, I mean, it really, that's the image that I see, right? It's a person saying, here's a resource, take it, do what you need to do with it, give it back to me, and we're even, we're good. So that kind of equal partnership relationship, I think, is a really important thing to perpetuate in the world, in terms of poverty alleviation, but in other areas too.
Yeah, and you also talk about these stories. I mean, the whole book is filled with the stories of different entrepreneurs. I mean, the clay water brick about the guy who just basically started digging clay up to turn it into bricks. I mean, that's the interesting thing, is that there is storytelling involved too, from these people, and there's also this kind of contact, this human contact. You talk a lot about how you really wanted to bring people in touch between the entrepreneur and the people who were funding, to really make that connection, that kind of human connection that we don't see online.
Well, it's funny, you're right. I mean, the book is filled with stories. I'm really happy about that. I like thinking that it's maybe surprising to a person who might read a typical business book that's focused on the stories of kind of the same old folks, you know. Here's a story about Zuckerberg. Here's the story about, you know, I don't know, Chuck Schwab, whatever. But these are not, they're not those guys. There's goat herders and seamstresses and farmers and rickshaw drivers that kind of, I think, have a lot of wisdom as well and can teach us quite a great deal. And so that was sort of the way that I wanted to frame the lessons in the book. So yeah, I'm happy that I can share those things, and I'm happy that I think, again, Kiva's allowed people to get involved and to participate in sort of a way that they couldn't before.
So, Khari, I'll put it to you. I mean, do you think that this kind of model might work within journalism when it comes to kind of micro lending or microloans?
Well, I think, you know, what's interesting for me, I started out, you know, this website started about a year ago, actually a year ago today, but you know, my first contact, I think, with crowdfunding was through, you know, loans that were being handed out by the International Rescue Center to refugees within San Diego who were advancing small businesses. And so I think it intrigues me. I don't know of a lot of examples of this specific model being used to make journalism possible, but there's parts of Kiva that just, you know, it's the same mind, and empowering those entrepreneurs who may be overlooked otherwise. But I mean, I really admire some of the teams that Kiva has. There's the team structure, and, you know, for example, like Stuff You Should Know, the podcast, they have a team. I think they have one of the largest teams on Kiva, and it's a community. You know, it's not a community like, you know, a geographic one, but it's a you know, community, and they've given away more than $3 million to entrepreneurs. So I mean, if journalists decided to make a similar team, I don't see why it couldn't have the same impact.
Yeah. And what do you think about, you know, journalists doing crowdfunding? You're obviously covering that pretty deeply. Do you think there are really good platforms? I mean, what platforms do you think work best when it comes to journalists? There's obviously Kickstarter, Indiegogo. There's so many out there. What have you found as far as the different platforms go?
I think when I interview people who do their own campaigns, they say that they appreciate working with platforms that are helping them in some instances, that are offering coaching. I mean, there's a big difference between a platform. I think it's called you know, like Photo Fund in Los Angeles. They've got, I think, a success rate of like 10 or 20%, and they're not, you know, doing very well, but by comparison, Seed and Spark says that they have a success rate of more than 80%. So I think there's, and if Kickstarter and Indiegogo are different animals because you just sort of do that on your own, but there's a larger audience. So, you know, I think it depends on what you want to get out of the platform and what you want to accomplish.
Yeah, no
because there's all
doubt.
these specialized platforms too, which is really interesting. There's Fun Dreamer down in Los Angeles that focuses on empowering minorities and women to do things. Seed and Spark just started a new initiative to help more women filmmakers get work done and documentaries done. So that's also very interesting.
Yeah, and speaking of specialized platforms, there's also Beacon. Dan, tell us a little bit about Beacon's model and how it works for crowdfunding for journalists and journalism projects.
Yeah, I mean, I think Khari identified something really important there, which is that in order for a crowdfunding platform to be successful, like, you have to offer something else. Like, to be completely honest at this point, like, crowdfunding technology is almost commoditized. There's no shortage of providers and niche sites that focus on a particular interest group or sort of services that allow you to roll your own crowdfunding module on your own site. And the problem isn't that people don't have options for how to do their crowdfunding campaign in journalism. It's often that they don't know how to do it, and that journalism is a particularly unique sale. It's it's unlike crowdfunding for a cooler on Kickstarter or for a video game on Indiegogo, in that, like, so much of it is predicated around how to effectively communicate the notion of what journalism is, why it costs as much money as it does, and ultimately the impact that it has in the world. So, like, for us to survive and for us to get to this point, we've had to get really good at working with reporters and now increasingly publications on how to best communicate that. And when you've been in the newsroom for many years and sort of shielded from, like, ultimately justifying the impact of what you do to an individual reader to the point at which they'll take out their wallet and give you money, like, that's sometimes an unfamiliar sale. Like, that's a little bit different than going out and being a reporter. So we spent a lot of time working with folks on that. But even that, I think it's not enough. I mean, for crowdfunding to be really interesting in journalism, like, I think microfinance is interesting. I don't think there's been a great example of someone yet who subsisted on small donations, other than maybe Andrew Sullivan to fund, like, a big enterprise. So for us too, like, we're always thinking about, like, what will it take to do $1 million or $2 million in a crowdfunding campaign, or to do $5 million for journalism in 6 months. And because of that, I think you've seen and you'll continue to see where we actually go out and do the fundraising for the journalists ourselves and put together pools of matching funds which you can apply to projects. So, I mean, I think, you know, the notion of how we think about being different at Beacon or what we do that's unique is ultimately, you know, working very closely with the journalists and then bringing some money to the table ourselves.
Right, and so people will pay kind of, it's more of almost like a subscription model, like a monthly fee versus just one project.
Nah, that's almost going away entirely. I mean, I think you can say that the evolution of Beacon almost has been away from microfinance as we've gone. Like, the first version of it was a $5 a month subscription. You could only pay $5. It was 30 freelance journalists. And we basically said, look, go out and see how many people you can get to sign up for $5 a month. Like, $5 a month isn't a ton of money if you're able to get 100 or 200 or 300 people to do this. Like, it adds up. But what we learned is journalists can't necessarily, an individual freelance journalist will struggle to find a paying audience large enough to support their work. And people who believe in journalism and want to support journalism often want to do so for amounts much more than $5 a month. We also had this notion of subscription as being the best way to do things, and we've learned more often than not people prefer one-time payments, particularly when it comes to access for content. Like, no one honestly cares about that. They fund journalism not because they want to hoard it for themselves and sort of keep it exclusive to them. They fund it because they want it to have as maximized of an impact as possible. So I think going forward, you know, some of this is just stuff we're going to roll out in the next few months. You'll see us downplay subscriptions a little bit and focus more on showing people the impact of the work that they've funded, whether that's published on a third-party site like the Texas Tribune, or whether it ends up being published on Beacon.
If I can, Mark, there was mention of there being no examples of publications that have figured out a way to sort of find sustainability or subsistence on crowdfunding alone. I've only come across 3. It's very, very rare, but Stratechery, a tech writer, he does only crowdfunding through his personal website. Canada Land which is by Jesse Brown, and the media criticism thing in Canada. And They Correspondent is a good example of one in Holland that continues to just baffle people on what they're doing, because they've been pretty successful, it seems like.
Yeah, actually, I should have mentioned some of those examples. I think the one exception to this rule, and like where crowdfunding works particularly well, is where business information is involved. Like, I think a lot of people subscribe to Stratechery. I forget how to exactly say it.
Yeah, they do.
Because it's core, like, in a lot of technology and a lot of thought around that, and he has like insight that people feel like they can make money on. I think it's part of the reason, you know, the Bloomberg Terminal subscriptions haven't lagged, or the Wall Street Journal like generally does pretty well on the subscription side. Whenever you're able to fashion a journalism product that people feel like will either make them money or will give them information that's actionable in some way, it's a lot easier of a sale to make.
Absolutely, and the first newspapers came from business publications, but Canada Land and Day Correspondent, not so much. I think their secret sauce may be that they just tapped into a pain point for the audience and found something that just fulfilled a need for people.
Jessica, I'm curious about your take. Have you considered this idea of, can the model from kind of Kiva or even like the microfinancing or the crowd financing model, maybe that would work within media or journalism, or do you think this is just, we're talking about apples and oranges?
I don't think it's apples and oranges, but I guess I do think it's important. Every site has its own, characteristics and things that make it run, make it work. I think with Kiva, it was a new thing to get closer to the voices of the people actually being served. I mean, it's we like to say it's broken, but it isn't. It's not necessarily a broken model. It just is the model that is the definition of nonprofits. But, in a traditional business, you have buyer and recipient as the same person. In a nonprofit, you have buyer, the donor, and recipient of the thing bought, the person in need. They're different. And so the feedback loop is not as tight. It's difficult to know what's working and what's not sometimes. So anyway, to get closer to that person who's being served, I think, was one of the things that made Kiva special. Also, the lending aspect made it special and made it new. So I'm always very flattered and really appreciate when people talk about the Kiva model for things, but I guess there are certain elements that I think are relevant and certain elements that aren't, and that don't really map to this particular topic. And I guess what I do get excited about is, this theme of sort of transparency, greater transparency, and there's three actually. So greater transparency, kind of ongoing accountability for like what happens next after the funding is out there. There's like a tie. It turns out, by the way, a loan in particular, which I know is not exactly what we're talking about, but a loan is a really sticky tool for connectivity because it's not just here's the money and hope it works out, but you're slowly getting money and information back over time, which keeps people engaged, I think, in a different way. So anyway, transparency, accountability, and then participation, right? I feel like that's two of my co-panelists here, right? Khari and Dan also mentioned this, but the idea that you want people to end up taking action, you want participation to happen in the end. I feel like Kiva it gave people obviously a new way to do that. So in terms of, does this work or not? I think it can work. I guess I have fears around some of the trends that Dan mentioned about he's seeing people wanting to fund things kind of discreetly, one at a time, not subscription based. Because I think in my experience, with journalism, it's really helpful to have people sort of constantly out there being eyes and ears on the ground in places where I can't be, where those of us that care about other parts of the world, can't be frequently. And the idea that, for example, a lot of traditional journalists, bureaus are closing over the world. There are not the idea that it would just be an on-demand sort of product, I think, has some risks, right? You might not be able to rely on people wanting to always hear what's out there at the right moment in time in such a way that everything can be coordinated quickly enough to get that information, to get those stories out. So I don't know. I'm a little bit sad to hear, Dan, that the subscription model is not necessarily the thing that has been working the best exactly, or is sort of the future as you see it. So I think that would be a good sign if it was. What do you think?
I would love it, and I mean, I think there's a chance that we could go back to. I mean, we're not removing subscriptions entirely.
Sure.
There's a minority, but a sizable minority that likes supporting journalists in that way. I think what we found though is like the construct of a crowdfunding campaign, the notion of having 30 days and like this goal, and it's this very public thing, and people are worried if you're going to cross the finish line for it, is a lot more effective than sort of making the case in the moment for like ongoing support, like to increase me to this, to the point where I'm getting $1,000 a month. I guess what I'm saying is like it's almost easier to raise $50,000 up front as part of a campaign than trying to find 50 people who add up to 1,000. 50 people who contributed $1,000 each over the course of that year.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like you need that deadline, you need that goal, and you sort of need that clock ticking forward in order to motivate people. And I think what we hope, and what we're increasingly seeing with folks we've worked with now that we're 2 years into this, is that after they do a year of reporting and after they sort of fund their first year, they can go back to the crowd and say, look at all the things we've accomplished, look at the impact we've had. Now we need to do this for another year, the next 3 years after this. Can you help us reach a larger goal? And part of the problem with crowdfunding is just like identifying who that audience is, who's going to get behind your work, like the early adopters early on. And if you run an early campaign and then come back a year or two later and try and do like a second version of it with bigger and better ambitions, you're starting from a base you didn't have before.
This has been a really good conversation.
Okay. Did you do you have some feedback? I mean, do you think, what is your take on? I mean, obviously we're talking about a little bit different things when we talk about microfinancing. But there is the storytelling aspect, and I know you probably found this out, that you're talking about bringing the audience really close to the journalist and understanding the audience understands the story of the journalist and what they're trying to tell. That's an important part of crowdfunding too.
Yeah, I mean, I would often say when I ran Spot Us that crowdfunding is itself a kind of storytelling, and it's interesting to hear the back and forth that Jessica and Dan just had, because there is a kind of social engineering that crowdfunding requires, right? The idea of having a goal and trying to meet it under this deadline is sort of this, it is a narrative, right? And having that somehow motivates people better than this idea of subscriptions, for better or for worse. That's what it is. And it's been interesting to see how crowdfunding in general has evolved and crowdfunding for journalism has evolved, because there's been a little bit of a divide. I think it's always been there, right? Like Kiva, which was one of the first crowdfunding sort of platforms, always had this idea of getting a return on your investment. It actually wasn't a donation. It was sort of an investment, and you'd get the money back and you could reinvest. Whereas crowdfunding in journalism has always kind of been seen more under the philanthropic model of you're giving a certain amount of money, and it's sort of like seen as giving to the commons, right? And so there's a different kind of narrative, a different kind of approach that maybe needs to be taken. Spot Us kind of wanted to kind of have a little bit of a Kiva. You could, in theory, the freelancer could sell the story then to a bigger media outlet, and the original donors would get their money back. We played with that, and we did it a few times, but that ended up being a lot more complicated of a proposition. And it's interesting because I think that says something, I think, about the media industry itself and freelancing within it. So there's always been a little bit of a divide, I think, in crowdfunding, how it's seen in general, and crowdfunding for journalism, which does have unique needs, which is why I'm glad that there's folks like Khari who are like, sort of studying it, and folks like Dan who are, building tools specifically for, crowdfunding for journalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think that maybe what works better is there's an established kind of independent journalism outfit, like let's say what the Texas Tribune did, where they raised money for doing live streaming during during a session in the legislature. I mean, maybe it's not just funding an entire thing, but maybe funding something that takes it to the next level. Basically, someone who needs a little bit of funding, to fix up something, revamp their site, and maybe they can pay people back. Maybe if they do have something that's more sustainable.
And I think, Jessica, you actually pulled out like one of the most powerful narratives we have, like when constructing these pages and making the pitch to people, which is almost the notion of insurance. Like, people are fearful. They know that the media is screwed up. They're fearful that there won't be someone covering things that are important to them. And like a lot of what we try and do is like almost key in on that and say, look, if you support this campaign and if you support this journalist, you may not read every story that they published, but you know that someone's there, and you know that you have an alert system so that when something really screwed up happens, you have this guy who you supported 6 months ago who's going to send you an email and tell you about it. And like it is a different value than getting equity in something or making a loan and earning a small amount of interest back or something like that. But people definitely see that as societally important, and they're definitely willing to pay to support things like that.
Yeah. Well, thanks, guys. I really appreciate the discussion. I want to thank our panel, Dan Fletcher at Beacon, Dave Cohn at Al Jazeera, Jessica Jackley, co-founder of Kiva.
Thank you.
Khari Johnson, Through the Cracks, and our producer, Jefferson Yen. You can catch us each and every week at MediaShift.org. Follow us on Twitter at the Mediatwits. Our past episodes are on SoundCloud and on YouTube. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to review us on iTunes. We'll catch you next week.